You are listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Welcome to this new episode of the Dark Fantastic Podcast. This is a very special episode with a very special guest, focusing on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So stay tuned and let's begin. What makes a creative partnership successful? Is it the chemistry between the collaborators, or is it the tension? Or is it the ability of one partner to compromise, letting the other dominate a little bit? In literature, not counting ghost-written books or James Patterson's novels, successful collaborations are somewhat rare. There are the acclaimed novels written by Joseph Conrad and Ford Madox Ford, including The Nature of a Crime and The Inheritors, and more recently there is Stephen King and Peter Straub's partnership on The Talisman and its sequel Black House, for example, and there are the wonderful Preston and Child novels featuring eccentric detective Aloysius Pendergrast. But for the most part, literary collaborations that are of any real value are somewhat rare. I think it has to do with the very personal nature of writing books and novels and short stories, because writing books is a very solitary thing. It's a sort of a type of meditation. So I think to involve someone else in that very personal, very meditative process is not easy. And I think for someone to collaborate with another writer, especially on such a complex and long process as writing a novel together, I think you have to really get along with that person, I think on many levels, because writing novels takes months, and sometimes it takes a year, and sometimes it takes even longer than that. So I imagine that doing that with another person is something similar to a marriage, and you have to agree, I think, on almost everything, at least in regards to creative tastes and creative sensibilities, in order to be able to finish the project without getting into numerous fights and disagreeing on a lot of things. Because with any creative endeavor, it's a very delicate balance, and it depends on mood and temperament and atmosphere, and it's a very complicated process. So I think that's part of the reason that writing collaborations, again, especially on novels, is very rare. And when it takes place successfully, if you go back and read the individual works of each author, you will find that there is a lot in common between them. Like the example I mentioned a couple of minutes ago of the collaborations between Stephen King and Peter Straub. Although they are different in some ways, but I think Peter Straub especially was very influenced by Stephen King's writing early in his career, because if you read Straub's earlier novels, like especially Julia, which is his first horror novel, It's very different than what Straub later wrote, because everything Straub wrote, especially in the 80s, including his most successful novel, Ghost Story, is influenced by King's writing to a large extent. And he has mentioned that he admires Stephen King's writing very, very much, and that it has actually influenced him. So he admits that. So for them to collaborate on such big novels as The Talisman and Black House, I think was somewhat natural. But movies and TV are another matter. Here, collaborations are more common. There is the partnership between Billy Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond, which produced a number of classic films, including Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, and The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. And there is the troubled partnership between Alfred Hitchcock and David O. Selznick, which resulted in the production of such classics as Rebecca, Spellbound, and one of my favorite Hitchcock movies, Notorious. But it also resulted in such disasters as The Paradigm Case, which is arguably Hitchcock's worst film. Which brings me to the most intriguing, to me at least, of all creative partnerships, which is the teaming of David Lynch and Mark Frost, who together created one of the greatest, if not the greatest, TV show of all time, Twin Peaks.
Summer 1990. A teenage boy in trouble. An evil that only comes out at night. Only a straight-to VHS movie can save him. From A. Kale, the author of Beware the Night. Bad Dreams. A thrilling horror novel, now available on Amazon. Rated PG-13, for some thematic elements and mild violence.
The debate on who should take credit for the magic of Twin Peaks has been going on for a long, long time. Numerous books have been written about the making of Twin Peaks, about what took place behind the scenes, especially of the first 2 seasons. And some say that the secret ingredient is Lynch's filmmaking, Lynch's vision, and his fascination with continuing mysteries and continuing stories. Others claim that Mark Frost, who's a very versatile screenwriter and novelist, is the one to thank for the fascinating storytelling and characters of the series. It's a complex question because I think it always gets very impassioned and very subjective answers. Season 1 of Twin Peaks, for example, is considered by most to be the series at its best. But Season 1 didn't involve Lynch very much. He was busy finishing up work on Wild at Heart, and Frost almost single-handedly oversaw the production of most of the episodes, with the exception, of course, of the pilot, which was shot and finished a year before the series aired, if not longer. And of course, David Lynch co-wrote the first 2 episodes of season 1 and directed 1 episode of the season, which is episode 2. But season 2, which in my opinion had some of the best episodes of the series, especially during the season's first half, heavily involved Lynch. But then it went astray and never recovered when Frost was left to his own devices. That lull between the death of Maddie and the unmasking of Laura Palmer's killer, and then the appearance of Wyndham Earle, there are about 10 episodes, 9 or 10 episodes in season 2 that are just, subpar. They are just, the writing on these 9 or 10 episodes is way below the level of season 1 and even the best of season 2. So again, it's a complex question because Frost was to a large extent responsible for at least the second half of season 2. So what went wrong and who's responsible? And again, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me is pure Lynch with no involvement from Frost whatsoever. But to me, Fire Walk With Me is an overwrought and bleak film, lacking the heart of the TV show, while The Missing Pieces, a collection of scenes deleted from the film and edited together by Lynch as a feature, is arguably one of the best things to ever come out of the Twin Peaks saga, capturing the mystery, the magic, and the horror of the TV show perfectly. And The Missing Pieces also had zero input from Frost. So Lynch was capable to a large extent of capturing the magic and the mood of Twin Peaks without Frost. Then there is Twin Peaks The Return, written by Lynch and Frost, which turned out to be polarizing and some might say disappointing. So what's the secret of Twin Peaks and who's responsible for its magic? And what's the secret of creative partnerships? It's a mystery and a fascinating question, not easy to answer. My guest on this episode is an author, publisher, and TV historian. He is one of the founders of Fayetteville Mafia Press, a writer-centric independent publisher dedicated to producing high-quality nonfiction. He is also a recognized authority on Twin Peaks, and his latest book on the show, Conversations with Mark Frost, is out now. He joins me on the show to talk about great television, how he became a writer, and, of course, about Twin Peaks. And during our discussion, we come across what might be the definitive answer to the question, will there ever be more Twin Peaks? Please welcome David Bushman. So, what books did you read as a kid that made you want to get into the business of writing and publishing?
Well, My favorite book is probably To Kill a Mockingbird, but I remember in sixth grade English, we read a book called Lost Horizon by James Hilton. And I remember that we got a writing assignment to sort of come up with an alternative ending. And we did the assignment in class, I think, or maybe it was at home. But in any event, the next day or a couple of days later, my English teacher read my answer. I loved the book. I totally loved it. And there's a movie with Ronald Colman, which is great too, from the 30s. But my English teacher read my answer, and he was the first person who made me think that maybe I mean, I hadn't even thought about it before, that maybe I had some talent for writing. I mean, not that I'm a great writer, but I think that, maybe I'm better than average. And then somehow I got in. So I figured, later on in life, what am I going to do with myself? And I figured journalism would probably be an interesting way to go. And I went to journalism school and graduated and got jobs on newspapers. And, I've been writing ever since.
So, what attracted you to nonfiction writing?
I mean, I took creative writing classes in school and college. And so, I mean, I've done short stories from that perspective. I guess from journalism to nonfiction writing is not that big a leap. And so it was something I was more comfortable with, and it's a lot easier to get it published than it is to get fiction published. And, I'd like to someday try fiction, but I think the kind of nonfiction that I do is not that different from journalism, which I have, decades of experience in. So it's just something I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is that, as you mentioned, your writing style or your voice it just reads like a novel, and that's why I'm looking forward to your new book, which we'll get to later, because I think it will read so much like a novel. But speaking of things you liked as a kid and things that got you passionate about writing, what about TV shows?
Well, not so much as a kid. I wouldn't identify shows that got me interested in writing, but in after college, I was working for a newspaper in suburban New York in Westchester County, and I actually I sort of had lost interest in TV, like a lot of people of my generation did at that point. But I was dating a woman who was really into a show called St. Elsewhere. I don't know if you know that show or not. It was a medical show, a fiction, and it was produced by MTM Enterprises, which also did the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Hill Street Blues. But I always thought, and I really got into that show. It was this really great combination of humor and drama, and it had some great writing. And Tom Fontana was one of the writers for it, and I think he's a great writer. He did Homicide, Life on the Street. It was executive produced by Bruce Paltrow, who's Gwyneth's dad. And it was a really good show, and it operated on a lot of different levels, and it was very sort of meta, and they did a lot of experimentation. They did like a dream show, and they did a black and white show. And so all this experimentation, I really got into that show. And then I kind of got back into TV, and I followed Tom's career especially. And like I said, he then went on to do Homicide, Life on the Street, which was based on a book by David Simon, who did The Wire, which was another really influential show for me. So I guess that, and then, that time when with St. Elsewhere, other shows, it was a renaissance time for TV. You had 30 something was on, and The Wonder Years was on, and just a bunch of Twin Peaks, of course, came on right around that time as well. So that was and then I went to work for Variety, and I was editing the TV pages. So it was incumbent on me to know TV, to be immersed in TV at that point because I was editing those pages, and that was my life. So that period of the like mid to late 80s and the early 90s was a really influential period for me.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about the journey to publishing your first book?
Well, when I was working at the Museum of TV and Radio, which is now called the Paley Center for Media, we got some money from General Motors to do a book on stand-up comedians and stand-up comedians on television. And that was a time where, all these shows were, Seinfeld was really big, and you had all these shows that were being fronted by stand-up comedians who were making the transition to sitcoms. So you had people like, I hate to mention Bill Cosby, but I will, because I think he started it all. But Roseanne, Seinfeld, Paul Reiser with Mad About You, Tim Allen with Home Improvement. Everybody was looking for the next stand-up comedian who could be the centerpiece of a sitcom. So we did that book, and I did a long introductory essay for that, and we had some great writers who contributed. That was kind of my first contribution to a book. Then I did a couple of essays for University of Chicago Press had an imprint called Intellect. And I did a couple of essays, one for a book on Twin Peaks and one for a book on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And then I had a colleague at the Paley Center who was writing books for Applause, which was a publisher owned by Hal Leonard. And my friend Arthur Smith and I approached them with a bunch of ideas. The first idea was for superheroes, and they actually accepted that ideas, but then they came back to us and said, we had gotten not very far into it, and they said that their attorneys were afraid that, Marvel and DC was they were very prone to lawsuits. So they said, let's stay away from that. So then they went down our list and they were looking for other things on our list. And it just so happened to be right around the time, right after Twin Peaks, it was announced that Twin Peaks was coming back, and Twin Peaks had been on our list. So that was how the first book happened. And, it was an interesting experience. But then the second book we did for them, which I think is the better book, because we've got all kinds of interviews in there, and was about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And then through the Twin Peaks connection, I was listening to different podcasts, one of which was Deer Meadow Radio, which was done by a guy named Mark Givens. And he did when I had done the Twin Peaks book, I had come across the Hazel Drew story. And then Mark, separately from me, had also come across it. And we both were really interested in it. And I reached out to him and said, would you be interested in doing a book on this? And he said yes. And that's how that book started. And then for a long time, I've been wanting to start a publishing company, which is kind of a crazy idea because it's hard. It's, to go up against these majors like Penguin and Macmillan and, Simon and Schuster. It's really hard. But, I actually found, I have tremendous admiration and respect for my partner in our company, Fayetteville Mafia Press, for Scott Ryan, who actually was crazy enough to say yes. And then we've been publishing, we've published about 10 books so far. And, we've got something like 6 books coming out next year. And we've already got books scheduled for the following year as well. So that's kind of taken off.
Yeah, that sounds great. I actually just recently learned about the Buffy book, and I'm gonna get a copy of that because I'm also a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It was one of my favorite shows as a teenager, basically, or maybe during college. But I'll definitely pick up a copy of that. I think it's also available as an ebook, right?
I think so. Yeah. I love that show too. And, I have two daughters, and we've watched it as a family like so many times, but I'm with you. I love that. Of course, Joss Whedon, who created it, is kind of toxic right now, but it doesn't take away from the accomplishments of the show and all the other people who worked on it.
How did your fascination with Twin Peaks start? Because reading your books, it seems that you are really you have become an authority on Twin Peaks, and of course you wrote, in my opinion, the most insightful book about Twin Peaks, which is Conversations with Mark Frost, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. But I want to know how it all started for you with Twin Peaks. I know you said that, of course, you were a fan watching it when it aired, but how did you become such a super fan, basically?
Yeah, well, I was editing TV copy at Variety in New York when Twin Peaks started. Reports about David Lynch coming to TV were circulating, and I remember, those stories about how ABC couldn't decide what to do with it. So we were editing stories about it a lot, and I was definitely hugely a huge fan of David Lynch's movies, which at that point I guess was Eraserhead and Blue Velvet and Dune, which was story unto itself. But so it was exciting news that Lynch was coming to TV, to not just TV but a broadcast network, which was unbelievable. I mean, who could imagine Lynch's stuff playing on broadcast television? Apparently the executives at ABC couldn't, because they were like hemming and hawing about putting it on, and we would, stories just kept going on and on about like what are they going to do with it, and then so I was interested in it for that reason. I mean, it got all this pre-premiere press, and I was interested in Lynch, and anyway, and then of course I was going to watch it because it was such a big deal, and the pilot blew most people away. It was an amazing pilot, so unlike anything that had been on any kind of TV, cable or network before. And I'm one of these people who didn't. I mean, there is like I think Mark Frost talks about this. There's like this 4 or 5 episode arc in season 2 where it suffers greatly, but then I think it picks up tremendously again when Wyndham Earl comes to town. Of course, it never got the viewers back after that. But I'm one of those people who thinks that, with the exception of like 4 episodes in season 2, that it was really high quality TV all the way through to the end. Unfortunately, almost nobody was watching by that point. They had been preempted because of the Gulf War. They had moved around the dates. They put it on Saturday night, which was a huge mistake. I mean, people who were watching Twin Peaks weren't home on Saturday night. So by the end, it kind of came in with a bang and went out with a whimper, as they say. And, that was my livelihood at that point, was sort of watching TV and trying to understand it and what was going on and trends and things like that. And so I was drawn to it for that reason, and then it was just so good.
It's a no-brainer by now. But anyone who's listening to this interview, of course, knows what we're talking about. But the pilot for Twin Peaks, and I don't know if you will agree with me on this, but I love the European version.
Yeah.
Because that's how I actually found out about Twin Peaks. I was in London, and I found a copy of VHS copy of the feature. On the box of the tape, they said a new feature film by David Lynch, because that's how it was marketed over there before I think the show aired. So I found this old VHS copy of this pilot, and I didn't know about David Lynch at the time. I hadn't watched Blue Velvet, and so just watching the pilot, especially the European version, was just mind blowing. I can't imagine how people felt watching something like that on television, because you did see it on TV when it premiered, right?
Yeah, 1990. That's really interesting, Ahmed, because you're the first person I've ever talked to whose first viewing of Twin Peaks was the European feature version. That's really interesting. I have never talked to anybody else who had that experience.
Yeah, I think it really affected how I view Twin Peaks, and how, because it was very hard for me to actually track down a copy of the series, because I had no access to cable TV at the time, and I think it wasn't running, maybe on Bravo, I think, or something. But for my generation, it wasn't really well known, and David Lynch hadn't really exploded yet, like he did later. Because I think he had like a second renaissance after Lost Highway, I think. But during the period between the ending of the Twin Peaks, era with Fire Walk with Me and maybe Lost Highway or The Straight Story, there was this lull in the middle, and I didn't know about David Lynch. And just watching that pilot, I had never seen the thing that attracted me the most, or surprised me the most, was the sound design, because I'd never seen anything that sounded like that. The sound design of that pilot in particular was just very, very, very strange. I don't know if you remember that.
I know that Lynch is very attentive to sound. I mean, there's that story about how when he made, I think it was Fire Walk with Me, that he sent out a note he insisted that the distributor send out a note with the reel, which they were using at that time, film reels, to play it at a certain level. And so I know that sound has always been really important to him throughout his work. But that kind of stuff, that's interesting that you say that, because that kind of stuff is a lot more difficult to control in television than it is in film. So I think he had to overcome a lot. I say he, and I mean they, him and Mark Frost, had to overcome a lot of network reticence or hurdles, and for anything. I mean, I'm sure that the network couldn't have cared less what the sound was, but anyway. So I have noticed the importance of sound in Lynch's work, all of Lynch's work. Yes.
Yeah, of course. I was just mentioning the pilot because I think because he basically, because of course when I'm talking about David Lynch, like you just said, I mean Lynch Frost, but Lynch is basically responsible for the technical aspects. I think we at least have to give him that. He has the final say when it comes to the filmmaking, I think, especially on the pilot. But I think the sound design of the pilot especially was a bit different than the sound design on the series, because I think he had total control over the pilot, and he treated it as a feature, so that's why it sounded so unique. But anyway, I think we are sounding too much like fanboys, so I think I'd better get back to the interview. So you write about this in your book, Conversations with Mark Frost, which is a wonderful book. I can't stress how much I love that book.
Thank you.
But can you talk a little bit about how you finally managed to convince Mark Frost to collaborate with you on this book? Because I think he was always a bit reticent, especially during the airing and after the airing of the final season. He was a bit reticent to talk about what went on, behind the scenes, and how did you actually manage to convince him to do the book, and how was it like working with Mark Frost?
So when I was writing the book Twin Peaks FAQ, I really started to think, it really sort of jumped out at me that Mark's contributions to Twin Peaks are, I think, unfairly, I don't want to say overlooked, but not completely valued at the level that they should be. So, I mean, it's, you'd see all these headlines of like Lynch is this and Lynch is that, and I think that's a terrible injustice. But I had already spoken to Mark Frost because we reached out to him through his publisher. He wrote those 2 Twin Peaks novels about the Hazel Drew story. So I had established a relationship with him through that. We reached out to the publisher and said, we're writing this book about Hazel Drew. Would Mark be interested in talking to us about that? So we talked to Mark and also his brother Scott, who was a writer for Twin Peaks as well. So I had that relationship with him. And then I reached out to him again and sent him an email and said, I'd really like to do something on your career beyond not just Twin Peaks, but all your work and in all of the different media. And I didn't get any answer from him at first. And then some time went by and I sent him another email and I said, I just wanted to check in and see if you've given this any thought. And he said, his reply was something like, I'm thinking about it. And then a little while after that, I got an email from him and it said, let's do it. I think it was something like that. So then I wound up talking to him about, I'm going to say maybe 15 times, about 15 times over the course of a year. And he was definitely more open about some things than other things. I mean, he didn't really want to interpret Twin Peaks for the readers. He really did want to kind of leave it. It was hard work to get him to comment on some of this, what some stuff meant, because he really didn't want to go there. He really wanted, and I remember having a conversation with him and him saying, well, it's whatever interpretation you bring to it, and I said, that may be, Mark, but as somebody who's studying your work, I think it's interesting to know what you think, how does it sort of fit in with the rest of your oeuvre and, the themes that you approach and the themes that you're attracted to and so on. So I made a little headway, but he was reticent to talk about that. And in terms of behind the scenes stuff that was going on, that also was something that he wasn't real eager to talk about. And I think you might get that sense from the book that there are things that he just, I think I even said to him at one point, is that all you're going to give me? And he said, that's it for now, or something like that. So there were certain topics that were difficult to draw him out on. And, we had some conversations that were off the record where he helped me, understand things a little bit better and contextualize them, but he didn't want to go on the record with them. So there was that element as well. But in terms of, by far, Ahmed, Twin Peaks was the hardest thing to get him to talk about. Absolutely. He was, so forthcoming with everything else that we talked about. But, and I think part of that is just that, it's not, Twin Peaks is not his alone, and he respects that. He has to, I think he respects that actually more than David Lynch does. That it's a co-production, but so I think he respected, that Lynch doesn't want certain things explained or stuff like that. So I think that's really where that came from.
Yeah, it comes across in the book, definitely. I think the way you structure the book and the way you approach him and the way you phrase the questions That's why I keep saying that to me, as a huge fan of Twin Peaks and David Lynch's work, and of course Mark Frost's work as well, as a writer and as an author, that's why I keep saying that your book, Conversations with Mark Frost, I think it is the most insightful of all the books written about Twin Peaks, because it's the only book I read about Twin Peaks that actually has the that has Mark Frost in some sort of an informal mood, or he's a bit of a confessional mood, I think, a bit, and he says things, although it's as I mentioned earlier, and I wrote a review of your book on my website, and I mentioned in the review that Frost never comes out and criticizes Lynch outright, but he has some very interesting and some might say negative things to say about Lynch and what went wrong with the final season, and why it was a bit, the return, Twin Peaks, the return, why it was a bit divisive, I think, because they seem to have a very interesting relationship. And Harley Payton, has commented on that and has talked about that in many podcasts. But in light of all that and your experience with Frost and your experience in writing the book with him, do you think down the line there will be another collaboration between Lynch and Frost?
Well, first of all, let me compliment you on your perceptive skills, because I think you are very accurate in what you just said. So in terms of reading between the lines, I think that was extremely perceptive on your part. Secondly, to answer your last question, I think, as Mark Frost, I think himself has said, never say never, but I do not think so, no.
Yeah, I got that impression from the book, and I don't want to, give away too much for readers who haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of the book. But I think the most telling line in your book about the relationship was when Mark says that he basically he was basically locked out of the editing room during the editing of The Return, and that he knew someone, he doesn't mention who, who worked in the editing room, who actually, smuggled out, I think, a rough cut of one of the episodes or something like that. I think that says it. I don't think that says it all. I mean,
I think. I think that is. I agree with you that is a illustrative comment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. It's a wonderful read, and I think it's a very good read actually for people who aren't even Twin Peaks fans, because it covers a lot of topics, and I think it's a very valuable book to writers and people who want to know about the writing craft and about how to make it, how to break into Hollywood, especially the TV industry. It's a great book. So you're welcome. I really mean it, because I read so many books, as I said, about Twin Peaks, and there are a lot of good books out there about Twin Peaks, but especially coming out of the Twin Peaks, The Return experience as a fan, I didn't know how I felt about that season, except maybe later when I watched it again. But your book actually, helped me and helped, I think, a lot of fans and a lot of people interested in TV history and the making of great TV shows to understand exactly how the season was shaped. And anyway,
how did you feel about The Return?
Well, I watching it because I watched it as it aired, and watching it, episode by episode, I have to admit, wasn't a very pleasant experience. every week, spread over 18 episodes, I didn't really get the Twin Peaks vibe out of it. But I later, I think after that, shocking finale, I took a break from watching Twin Peaks for, I think, maybe a year or something. And then I bought the return on DVD, and I watched the whole series and the movie Fire Walk with Me, in sequence.
Mhm.
And when you watch the whole, saga in sequence, I think it's a different experience. And I think if you do that, I think you like the return more, and you get into it more, and you actually get what Mark Frost, I think, was going for when you do that. And I don't know if my reaction was colored with that second viewing, because between the first and the second viewing of The Return, I read the two books that Frost put out, and I loved the final dossier. I think I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's. I don't want to say it's better than The Return, because that's not fair. But I think The Return is incomplete without the final dossier.
Right.
That's my opinion.
Right.
I don't know if you agree with that.
I like both books too. I mean, I have not watched The Return since it aired. So I think it's kind of unfair for me in a way to comment on it, because I really should go back and revisit. I mean, obviously I was blown away by what was a Part 8 and everything. Are you a Wes Anderson fan at all?
So and so. I don't think, I like some of his stuff, but I like Rushmore very much. But some of his later stuff, I think, was too self-indulgent. But I respect him as a filmmaker. He's definitely, a singular filmmaker for sure.
It's interesting that you said, I sort of make this analogy sometimes between Lynch and Wes Anderson, and that I just saw The French Dispatch. I don't know if you saw that. And I think that, and again, I've only seen it once, so I don't know. But to me, The French Dispatch is a movie that I have great admiration for, but Royal Tenenbaums is a movie that I love. I think there's a distinction there, and I sort of sometimes feel that way about what Lynch does. And I guess I think I think the two novels, there was stuff in the final dossier that I probably would have preferred not to know. Like, I'm not one of those people who needed to know what happened to Donna or whatever. I didn't need to go there. But there was stuff in the two books that I thought was great, and then there was maybe some stuff that I thought, I think Mark said he did it because he felt like fans deserved to know what happened to these characters. I wouldn't put myself in that camp that I needed to know what happened. I mean, and Donna was, so many people hated Donna, but I really liked her. I didn't need to know what happened to her. But I do think, as trite and as it is, that in many ways, Mark brought the heart, and David brought the how do I say this? I thought David is more cerebral, maybe, and then Mark, Mark is definitely a humanist, and so much of the warmth of Twin Peaks is, I think, due to what he did, and I think that comes through in the books more than in The Return.
I want to talk a little bit about your upcoming book, Murder at Teal's Pond, Hazel Drew and the Mystery That Inspired Twin Peaks, which you co-wrote with the Mark T. Givens. It comes out, I think, next January. Can you talk a little bit about that book? Because I think it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, so that book, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you get it in December, but otherwise it comes out January 1st. As I mentioned, Mark Givens and I each had separately come across Mark Frost talking about the murder of a young woman. He called her Hazel Gray, and he just said it was upstate New York, where his grandmother had a summer home, and he and Scott, and later, I guess, Lindsay, their sister, would go visit the grandmother every summer. And that's all I really knew. That's all we really knew about it at that point. And we couldn't find, I couldn't find a Hazel Gray when I was writing the Twin Peaks FAQ book, but I did find a Hazel Drew. And I did mention at the time that in the book, I think I said he must have been talking about Hazel Drew in Troy and Sand Lake, New York. And that was all I had time to do with it at that point, but I sort of stored it in the back of my head that I wanted to do more about it. And that's when I reached out to Mark Givens, and we spent like 6 years researching it. And the story is basically this, that this 20-year-old woman named Hazel Drew, who was a housekeeper in Troy, and she worked for 3 different households. Each of the men in the household were, as it turned out, were extremely powerful people in Troy. One was the city treasurer, another was city engineer, and the third was a very wealthy coal manufacturer who ran. Two of the 3 ran for mayor, but 2 of the 3 held public office, and so she came from these very modest, poor country family, and then she wound up working in 3 of the most powerful households in Troy. And on July 11th, 1908, her body was found by some campers in a pond up in the woods of Sand Lake, New York, a hamlet called Taborton Mountain. And she had been struck with some instrument to the back of her head, and died before. She didn't drown. She died and then was thrown into the water. That's what the autopsies revealed. And they never found the killer. So Mark and I wanted to go back, and this was one of two stories that influenced Mark when he was dreaming up Twin Peaks with David Lynch, who had his own inspirations, and we all know about his fascination with troubled blonde women, so we know where he was coming from. But Frost had these 2, and that was one of 2 incidences that played a role in his contribution to the Laura Palmer arc. And they never found the killer. And Mark Givens and I, spent 6 years researching this, and we think we've come up with a pretty credible explanation as to what happened. It's interesting because we've gotten reviews in the trade press so far, and Publishers Weekly and Book List, and they both, thankfully, were very positive reviews, but they both said whether you buy their explanation or not. So I think it's pretty believable, but of course, there's no smoking gun. It's 113 years old, the murder. So we didn't have any DNA to work with, or any witnesses to talk to, or anything like that. But I think we present a pretty credible scenario.
I think Mark Frost wrote the introduction to the book, right?
He did, Ahmed. He did write the introduction to it, and it's really good. I mean, he's such a good writer, and he did write the introduction. I also wanted to mention, we were talking about fiction before. The first version of this book that Mark Givens and I wrote, was pretty journalistic. And we were working at that time with a company called Metabook, and they came up to us and said, no, you've got to make this creative nonfiction. So we reworked it, and it really, I hope and think, does read like a novel. So, there were times we took a little creative liberty in terms of, like, if it said, John Smith, met with the press that day, we might have imagined, and we state this up front, that we're imagining some of the dialogue, not all of it. There's a lot that we got out of newspapers from the time, but there is a little bit of, we did rely, this is a little bit more imaginative than the other stuff that I've written.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that.
Well, I really hope you'll let me know what you think of it. I'd love to hear your opinion. When you
Yeah, definitely. So, what's coming up for you? What are you working on now?
Well, we've got this publishing company, and in January of next year, we have a book coming out on The Wire with a collection of essays written by African American critics, taking a look at The Wire and sort of in the era of Black Lives Matter, which is a really good book. And then in March, we have a book coming out on the women of Genji Cohen. So the women characters in shows like Orange is the New Black and Weeds and so on. And then my next book, Scott Ryan, my partner at FMP, has a book coming out next year on Fire Walk with Me, which is a completely different type of look at that movie. And then my next book which is written and sort of now in the proofing stages or editing stages, is a book about a police force and up in upstate New York that looking at like this period around the turn of around 2000, where 4 members of the police force wound up, this is in Schenectady, New York, wound up going to prison for what they were doing was trading drugs for information. And it was actually the basis of a movie called The Place Beyond the Pines that was made a few years back with Ryan Gosling and Bradley Cooper. But I look at it through the eyes of the chief, the man who was chief at that time, who later himself, after he retired, he was forced to resign as a result of this. And later on in his life, he got arrested and did some time in jail for cocaine possession. So that's my next book, and that should be out sometime in 2023. And after that, I'm not sure what's next, but I'll be working on something.
Well, I'll definitely look out for all these books, and I'll check out your press as well, and see all the books that have been published by your press. And I don't want to take any more of your time, and I've already taken a bit too much. So thank you very much, David, for joining me on the show. I've wanted to do this for a while now, and again, for anybody who hasn't read Conversations with Mark Frost, you really should pick up a copy of that book. If you are a filmmaker, a writer, a person interested in TV history, a person interested in the career of Mark Frost or David Lynch, or of course, someone interested in Twin Peaks. So thank you, David, and I hope you join me again on the show.
Oh, I would love to. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the support. I really do. And it's been a real pleasure talking to somebody, who is, first of all, a supporter, but secondly, the level of conversation and insights, it was really provocative and inspiring. So thank you very much, Ahmed.
She's dead. Wrapped in plastic.
Look, you guys, please, what did I do? What's going on?
Entering the town of Twin Peaks. FBI.
Right.
Something troubling you, Bobby? You want to tell us about it?
Oh, God. You think I killed her?
There it is. Oh, my God, here it is.
Twin Peaks. Next.
Sheriff, we got a lot to talk about.
I'd like to end this episode with a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. It's called Annabel Lee, and this version is read by Ed Good and is taken from the LibriVox website, and you can download this poem and many other poems, stories, and novels from the website. And thanks for listening to this episode of the Dark Fantastic Podcast. And please join me again soon.
It was many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of ANNABEL. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my ANNABEL. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that, long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful ANNABEL, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my ANNABEL. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who are older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful ANNABEL. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of my beautiful ANNABEL, and the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful ANNABEL. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea.
You've been listening to the Dark Fantastic Podcast.
Flashes in the dark. Tiny stories. Vast dimensions. The Highway.
The car sped down the dark highway. Not too fast, but fast enough. He wanted to leave it all behind. The town, the mystery, the girl he thought he loved. He gripped the steering wheel. He put some pressure on the brake pedal. Should he go back? Should he go deeper? Did he really want to know? Or was it better to remember her the way he did now? Beautiful, pure, kind. Before the blood ran down the sand, and she was lost to him forever. He stopped the car. The road ahead was dark. The way back was darker.
Copyright Ahmed Khalifa, 2021.
Ahmed Khalifa is a filmmaker and novelist. He is the writer-director of several short films and a feature, released on Netflix, and the author of a number of novels and short stories, including Beware the Stranger, available on Amazon.